Hello everyone, my name is Kathleen Allen. I'm a social researcher in the Marine Analytical Unit in Marine Scotland, and I'll be presenting some work that we commissioned the Diffley Partnership to carry out, looking at the public perceptions of offshore wind farms in Scotland. This work was done with funding and support from NatureScot, who were actively involved in the scoping out and advising on the work. With offshore wind set to expand in Scotland in the near future, it's important to understand what this might mean for people living near to an offshore wind development. Most existing research focuses on attitudes to offshore wind energy in general, or reasons for opposing particular wind farms, often during planning. There is very little research looking at the experiences of local people during the construction or operational phase, making it difficult to predict what impacts in the future might be. As a first step to filling this evidence gap, we commissioned a survey study targeting people living on the coast and near offshore wind farms, as well as the wider population, to find out what their experiences have been. So now I'll give you a brief outline of the presentation to come. I've already given an introduction, so next I'll summarise the approach we took to the study and the methods that we used, before moving on to the results. I've split these into three sections. These are overview of perceptions of offshore wind farms in Scotland, which looks at how the wider population views offshore wind energy, understanding the impacts of offshore wind farms, which focuses on the experiences of those living near an offshore wind development, and understanding whether offshore wind farms affect recreation and tourism decisions. I'll conclude by summarising the main findings of the research. We used an online survey for this study, which ran in February 2021. We achieved a total of 2,065 responses, which consisted of a representative sample of 1,000 adults from the national population in Scotland and 1,065 adults from the Scottish postcodes with a coastal sea border. The survey was administered through the ScotPulse online panel. This is a dedicated online research panel with members across Scotland, including those in remote, rural and coastal areas, which was key for the success of this research. As the study was done during COVID, we felt this was the best way of reaching people for the research. ScotPulse also holds information about respondents such as age, gender, sector of employment, and we were able to explore whether there was any difference in response between these subgroups. In most cases, we didn't find significant differences or trends, which was an interesting finding in itself. So before I go into the results, I just want to explain a few definitions relating to the samples used in this study. Because of the way the questionnaire was designed, the sample will be different for certain sections of the study. There were some parts of the questionnaire that were answered by all respondents and some that were answered only by those living near the coast, as I mentioned in the approach. A further subset consisted of those with lived experience of an offshore wind farm. This was defined as those who have the same outward postcode as an area which is used during the construction of an offshore wind farm. This includes areas where there is onshore infrastructure, where the offshore cables make landfall, and areas which are parallel to the offshore development. So now I'll move on to the results. This section gives an overview of the perceptions of offshore wind developments in Scotland. We wanted to get an idea of how offshore wind energy was perceived in the context of other activities going on in the marine space. We asked respondents, how important or not do you feel these sectors or industries are to Scotland in terms of their social value? And we included a brief description of social value to make sure that everyone understood this concept in the same way. The question included a list of 11 coastal sectors and industries to rate, including renewable energy, non-renewable energy, coastal protection, and ports and harbours, amongst others. Many industries scored highly in terms of their social value, but renewable energy scored the highest, with 91% of respondents saying that renewable energy is important to Scotland in terms of its social value. We also asked how the same coastal industries and sectors were considered in terms of their economic value and provided a description of this term as well. Once again, renewable energy scored highly, with 89% of respondents considering the renewable sector to be important in terms of its economic contribution to Scotland. So then we asked, to what extent do you approve or disapprove of offshore wind farms? So 4 out of 5 people in both coastal and national samples approve or strongly approve of offshore wind farms. We also asked all respondents if they were aware of an offshore wind farm near to where they live. Nearly a quarter of national respondents said they were aware of an offshore wind farm, while 43% of coastal respondents had some awareness of an offshore wind farm near to them. We looked into whether awareness of an offshore wind farm had an effect on approval and found that approval was highest among those who were aware of an offshore wind farm nearby. This suggests that having some experience of a wind farm does not necessarily lead to a negative view of them and may actually lead to more positive feelings towards them. So the next section is about understanding the experiences of those living near an offshore wind development. So the results presented here all relate to the lived experience group, which, if you remember, is a subset of the coastal sample. So we asked respondents to think about the impact of offshore wind farms in their area, and we asked, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statements? So the statements included things about local economy, the coastal landscape, recreation. 2/3 of these respondents tended to agree or strongly agree with a statement that offshore wind farms provide a boost for the local economy, while 2 in 5 agreed that they are a positive feature of the coastal landscape, and around a third agreed that they create new recreational opportunities. When it comes to the impact of offshore wind farms on the traditional image of the coast, opinion is divided, with 34% agreeing that they detract from the traditional image and the same proportion disagreeing. For this question, we also found differences between subgroups. So 34% of those aged between 45 to 54 strongly agree with the statement that offshore wind farms provide a boost to the local economy, compared to only 17% for those aged 65 and over. We then asked respondents, what impact, if any, do you think that offshore wind farms in your area have had on the following? And gave a number of options, including feelings for the future, community relations, community character, amongst other things. In most cases, the responses suggest that the impact of offshore wind farms has been neutral, with most people responding no impact. There is evidence of some perceived positive impacts. 43% said that offshore wind farms have a positive impact on their feelings for the future, and 33% perceived a positive impact on local infrastructure. Opinions on the impact of offshore wind farms on the local landscape or seascape character were split fairly evenly, with 27% saying that offshore wind farms had a positive impact and 25% saying that the impact was negative. We explored whether the impacts of offshore wind farms had met expectations, asking, thinking about the offshore wind farm closest to you, has the impact of it been better than you expected, worse than you expected, or as you expected in terms of the following issues? Options they were given included employment, landscape and outdoors, and general disruption. For all options, impacts have broadly been in line with what respondents expected. Benefits to the local community and local job opportunities have been better than expected for 1 in 5 respondents. We asked respondents about the different components of the offshore wind farm near to them and what impact each has had. The options that were given included the community benefit schemes linked to the wind farm, the broader port area, the onshore infrastructure, and the turbines. In all cases, the vast majority of lived experience respondents reported either no impact or that they did not know. The components which had the most positive impacts were community benefit schemes, which 27% saw as positive, and the broader port area, which 23% considered to be positive. We wanted to know if the experience of living near an offshore wind development had changed people's opinions regarding offshore wind farms. A clear majority, 85%, indicated that they approved of offshore wind farms before one was developed nearby and still approve of them now. A very small proportion said that they had changed their mind one way or another, with 4% changing their minds from disapproval to approval and 2% from approval to disapproval. Where respondents had changed their mind about offshore wind farms, we asked them to give reasons for this change. This was a very small number of respondents, and you can see some of their answers here, along with the wind farms they live near to. Those who now approve of offshore wind farms often commented on job creation, benefits to the environment, and their increased knowledge of offshore wind farms as the reason for changing their opinion. Those who now disapprove of offshore wind farms cited the impact on wildlife and seascapes. All respondents, from both the national and coastal sample, were asked to think about any factors which might change their mind about offshore wind farms in the future. This was an open text question and so had fewer responses. Of those who did respond, the majority of those who already approved of offshore wind farms did not expect to change their mind in the future, suggesting that they see offshore wind farms as a long-term positive feature. Finally, we wanted to understand whether and how offshore wind farms influence people's decisions regarding tourism and recreation in coastal areas. So we asked, in planning a visit to a coastal area in Scotland, have you ever deliberately avoided visiting an area because there are offshore wind turbines visible from the shore? The vast majority, so that's 86% of national respondents and 88% of coastal respondents, have not avoided visiting an area due to the presence of offshore wind turbines visible from the shore, while just 4% of respondents have done so. We wanted to know whether taking part in different activities at the coast had an effect on a respondent's view of offshore wind farms. We asked people what leisure activities they take part in at the Scottish coast and gave options for a range of leisure activities, including walking, wildlife watching, swimming and sailing, amongst others. You can see from the graph that walking, hiking or running was the most popular activity among respondents. We then cross-referenced these results against the responses about approval or disapproval of offshore wind farms. We found that approval for offshore wind farms remains high regardless of the activity undertaken by those who visit Scotland's coast. Approval remained between 75 to 86% for all recreational activities. The highest level of approval was found amongst those who visit the coast to enjoy seafood, whilst the lowest level of approval, which is still 75%, was found amongst those who do canoeing and kayaking at the Scottish coast. We asked respondents whether being able to see offshore wind farms while on holiday would make them more or less likely to choose that holiday. 4 out of 5 respondents say being able to view turbines from an offshore wind farm while on holiday in Scotland would make no difference to their choice of holiday. So that's everything from the results section. To conclude, here are some of the main findings from the study. So the majority of people from both samples, so that's national and coastal, approve of offshore wind farms, and this remains the case regardless of demographic subgroup or locality and persists even with lived experience of an offshore wind farm. Those who approve of offshore wind farms have not changed their minds, and local economic benefits are regarded as the main benefit among those who live in coastal areas. Finally, renewable industries are seen by national and coastal respondents alike as more socially and economically valuable than non-renewable industries, though it must be said that non-renewable industries still have high value. So I want to say a big thank you to the Diffley Partnership for working with us on this, to NatureScot for their funding and support, and to the advisory group for their valuable input throughout the project.
Welcome everyone. I am part of the National Marine Plan team, and today we would like to introduce you to the new National Marine Plan. For anyone who is not familiar, marine planning is a practice to help manage the multiple uses of our seas and oceans. Unlike other types of planning, such as land use planning or urban planning, marine planning is a relatively new activity in Scotland. Marine planning activities often result in the creation of a plan, strategy, or framework. These are then used to guide decisions on how, when, and by whom certain activities can be undertaken in the marine environment. Marine planning matters in Scotland's inshore waters out to 12 nautical miles are governed by the Marine Scotland Act 2010, and in its offshore waters, 12 to 200 nautical miles, by the UK Marine and Coastal Access Act 2009. These are commonly referred to as the Marine Acts. In Scotland, marine planning activities are undertaken nationally, regionally, and for specific sectors. Scotland's National Marine Plan, referred to as NMP, was adopted in 2015 after the passage of the Marine Acts. It is a statutory document that all relevant authorities must follow, with some exceptions. The plan provides the overarching policy framework to guide decisions on how Scotland's marine space is used and translates UK-level ambitions, set out in the UK Marine Policy Statement, into policy and spatial guidance for regional and sectoral marine planning. The Scottish Government's Marine Scotland Directorate undertakes spatially explicit planning for specific marine sectors, including offshore wind and targeted oil and gas decarbonisation. It also supports regional marine planning partnerships, made up of local stakeholders who reflect marine interests. 3 marine planning partnerships have been established to date, Orkney, Shetland and Clyde, for which regional marine plans are being drafted. No adopted regional marine plans are currently in place. The Marine Act set out requirements for statutory review of the National Marine Plan every 3 years. Since 2015, the NMP has been reviewed in 2018 and 2021. The 2018 review focused on the effectiveness of the plan. It found that the number of policies and general aspects of the NMP were effective or useful to decision-making. It also noted that there were some challenges to the implementation of NMP policies, including those caused by the uncertainty around the UK exit from the EU. The second 2021 review examined the effectiveness of the NMP in light of other relevant matters, including the global climate emergency, COVID-19 pandemic, UK exit from the EU, and the implications of wider Scottish Government strategies like the Blue Economy approach, the Future Fisheries Management Strategy, and our legal commitment to achieve net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases by 2045. The 2021 review concluded, firstly, that the NMP remains effective, but could benefit from an improved evaluation framework. Secondly, the review of relevant matters impacting the NMP points strongly to the need to replace it to better address these emerging issues. Consequently, ministers considered the review recommendations alongside stakeholder feedback and announced their intention to update and replace the existing National Marine Plan in Parliament in October 2022, and via a commitment in the Scottish Government's Programme for Government 2022-2023.
Based on the recommendations in the 2018 and 2021 reviews, the purpose of the National Marine Plan 2 will be to address the global climate and nature crises by carefully managing increased competition for space and resources in the marine environment. The second National Marine Plan, which we refer to as NMP2, must deliver a new policy framework for licensing and consenting decisions that better reflects the evolving environmental conditions, demands on marine space, and sustainable use, as well as policy developments that have taken place since 2015. It must account for increasing competition for marine space and aim to balance existing and emerging uses, and it must help deliver Scottish Government priorities such as the outcomes set out in the Blue Economy Vision, net zero targets, and a just transition. The Scottish Government published Scotland's Blue Economy Vision and Blue Economy Approach in 2022, setting our ambitions to 2045. The vision currently set out in the existing National Marine Plan is very closely aligned to delivery of the aims of the Blue Economy Approach. The NMP2 and the Blue Economy Vision have been developed for different purposes, and the NMP2 will be a key delivery mechanism for the Blue Economy Approach. The policies and objectives set out in the NMP2 will reflect the aspirations of the Blue Economy Vision and will deliver some of the actions required. Development of the new National Marine Plan is ongoing, and it will be a multi-year process. This is the indicative timeline for major milestones in the NMP2 development process. We are currently in the first stage of the timeline, and we anticipate adoption of NMP2 in autumn or winter 2025. Key opportunities for stakeholders to engage with the NMP2 development are highlighted in the existing stakeholder engagement strategy. A link to this document will be provided at the end of the presentation, but we'd also like you to please note that the public consultation period is listed on the timeline, and we anticipate this to be around summer 2024. In October 2022, we published a stakeholder engagement strategy for the new NMP, or NMP2. It details our commitment to inclusive, targeted, and transparent engagement to ensure a broad range of stakeholders are consulted, so that well-informed decisions that benefit everyone are made. We published a stakeholder survey in October. Initially, it helped us to understand our stakeholders' expectations for engagement, and it now allows us to broaden our stakeholder contact list. We will share the link to the survey at the end of the presentation if you would like to hear from us with future updates. We want to include stakeholders at early stages of development of NMP2, and this is why we will host an interactive workshop tomorrow where you will have the opportunity to take part in a live Q&A with David Pratt, who is the Head of Marine Planning and Development at Marine Scotland. During the workshop, there will also be smaller group discussions with our policy colleagues who would like to hear your views on the current National Marine Plan. We would like to start the session tomorrow with a question from the audience, so please ask us anything using the link we are sharing now, and we might choose your question to open the session. We hope to see you there.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Giulia Agnisola, and I'm a Senior Policy Officer for Sectoral Marine Planning. Today, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction on Sectoral Marine Planning, the process, where we came from, the work, and also how it links to ScotMER. So the Marine Scotland Act 2010 identified the need for a National Marine Plan, and within this National Marine Plan, we have a renewable energy policies that sets up the need for sectoral marine planning processes to identify where is best to deliver renewable energy development. So our process is an integrated process that brings together spatial planning, strategic assessments, and statutory consultation and engagement. The strategic assessments are the strategic environmental assessment process, habitats regulation appraisal, and socioeconomic impact assessment. All of this, the output of these assessments and the consultation and spatial planning, delivers sectoral marine plans with plan option for sustainable development. Creating, therefore, framework for consenting. They also have sectoral marine plans have built-in review to ensure that the conclusions are always based on the best available information, and also identifies receptor mitigations, for example, for seabirds. The sectoral marine plans are used for what we refer to as a plan-led seabed leasing for offshore wind. We had ScotWind last year, and at the moment we have the innovation targeted oil and gas process that is ongoing. As you can see from this diagram on the left, our process starts with a scoping assessment report, which is areas of search report, which is primarily spatial work, and then it goes down through strategic more assessment work, which is the HRA, strategic environmental assessment, socioeconomic, and then finally we have the draft plan, and then we have a consultation at the end before then it gets finalized and adopted by ministers. What plans we have adopted so far? Actually, we have one, the Sectoral Marine Plan for Offshore Wind Energy, which created the basis for ScotWind. It identified 15 plan options, and the assessments were based on a scenario of 10 gigawatt. Then we have ScotWind and the clearing process, which identified 20 projects for a total of 27.6 gigawatt of potential generation. You can imagine that is a little bit different. So this could be new information that identifies the new information that impacts on the conclusions of the plan. Therefore, we are now starting the reassessment work for the Sectoral Marine Plan for Offshore Wind Energy. The other work stream that we have ongoing is the innovation in targeted oil and gas, which is a leasing round and planning process that supports the decarbonization of oil and gas assets and innovative projects for offshore wind. The leasing round closed in December, and hopefully we're going to have an announcement in April. The assessment work has already started and is ongoing. As I mentioned earlier, we have like sector level mitigation, and in particular for seabirds, the habitats regulation appraisal identified two main groups that were like, let's say, controversial from an impact point of view on seabirds. The first group, we refer it as site as highly constrained sites, and they are primarily in the northeast area, except the E3 small projects, which is obviously in the east region. And the main issue with these projects is that they have a cumulative impact on protected species. We identify basically the habitats regulation appraisal process, identify adverse effects on site integrity. And the line in the plan says no development shall be permitted until further evidence of reduction of this effect is presented. We have a group of specialists that supports the planning process and provides advice in relation to these problematic groups, which we name the Ornithology Working Group. And the Ornithology Working Group has been working on identifying the questions for the highly constrained sites. So what do we need to know? What do we need to answer? And actually also look at the deliverability of these projects and refining a little bit what needs to be identified and what evidence it needs to be collated. The other group is the sites that are subject to further regional surface. These are E1 and E2, and basically the habitats regulation appraisal couldn't identify whether or not there was a likely significant effect. So there wasn't enough information for us to conclude a likely significant effect. And so the Ornithology Working Group provided advice on the extent of the regional surveys needed and what was needed in terms of like survey effort. So the developers have been delivering area surveys for the last year, and ScotMER in particular has been working on a feasibility study for tagging. So I already mentioned there is a link, there is a tagging study that ScotMER has been working on, but also something has been published last year, which is a ScotWind roadmap of action, which is extremely useful. And we have basically a list of projects that are needed for the Northeast region in particular. And these, for the deliverability of this project, is quite essential to have engagement and collaboration with developers. That is a key aspect of our work. And also the Ornithology Working Group role. The Ornithology Working Group has really supported the identification of these projects, but also will have a similar role in the future in providing advice on what is needed and the evidence that comes out of this research. In the making, as well, in terms of what is needed for plan assessment, we are looking at things like what is needed from a fisheries point of view, but also social impacts and how to test the social impacts identified within the planning process. This is just a little bit of an introduction. If you have any more questions, please feel free to contact me or to contact the Sectoral Marine Planning team at our email address. Thank you very much.
In this session, we wanted to give you an overview of ScotMER as a whole, as I'm aware that for some of you this will be your very first ScotMER symposium, and welcome and thank you very much for coming along and joining us. And for many of you, you've been here quite a few times before, and so some of this, although may seem a bit repetitive, quite a few things have changed in ScotMER recently. And I also appreciate that some of you work in a specific area of ScotMER, whether that be in our receptor groups or just on a research project. So we wanted to give you what ScotMER is as a whole in a quick run through. So I wanted to thank Ms McAllen for opening today, and as she talked about in her speech, the Scottish Government, we're investing in research to promote the sustainable development of offshore renewable energy, and to do this we will ensure that we use the best available science when considering planning and consenting of our offshore energy developments to contribute to our low carbon future and delivering net zero. So ScotMER has three main components. We have receptor groups that identify and prioritise evidence gaps. We then have a research programme to address those evidence gaps, and we communicate the output of these research activities. So as you've heard from the National Marine Plan team today already, why do we need ScotMER? We support net zero, as Ms McAllen mentioned, and this helps us enable evidence-based decision making and consenting in the planning process. And Scotland's National Marine Plan, General Principle 19, decision making in the marine environment will be based on sound scientific and socioeconomic evidence, and ScotMER provides this. Again, you've heard from the Sectoral Marine Plan team who've just talked about ScotWind and INTOG, and I won't go over some of the work they've done, but again, ScotMER helps to support these by providing evidence. So how are we going to achieve this? As I said, there's three main components. We identify and prioritize evidence gaps through our receptor groups. We then take these evidence gaps and undertake research to understand and address these evidence gaps. We then communicate these research outputs through events like today, through the symposium, but we also publish a lot of our work online as well. So the receptor groups, you're going to hear from quite a few of these receptor groups over the next 3 days. We have diagamous fish, so that is your salmon and sea trout that spend some of their time in freshwater and some of the time in the marine environment and migrate between the two. Marine mammals, so whales, dolphins, but also seals. Socioeconomics, we also have physical processes, so how the ocean moves, the ocean currents, but also the ocean chemistry, ocean acidification, and nutrient mixing and things like that as well. Benthic environment, so these are the creepy crawlies that live on the seabed, so your lobsters, your crabs, your starfish, and other creatures that live on the seabed. Fish and fisheries, very important, particularly for the fishing community, and we engage with fishermen in this receptor group, and they form an integral part of this group and also the diagamous fish group. And then finally, ornithology. So that's the seabirds that live along Scotland's coasts. And these are receptor groups, and each receptor group contains individuals from, experts from academia, experts from industry, and also other organizations that may be interested in that particular receptor. So these could be charities, other non-governmental organizations, but also regulators like ourselves at the Scottish Government that are involved in all of these receptor groups. And these receptor groups get together and meet once or twice a year to discuss any changes to the evidence and also how can we address that. So over the last year, all of the receptor groups have met at a minimum of twice, sometimes up to 3 or 4 times, to discuss the evidence maps. And the evidence maps, all 7 of them, were updated on the 26th of January and are now publicly available on the ScotMER website. And that's the link to the website, but we'll also post it in the chat as well for you. So the research projects, you'll get to hear loads of project outputs over the next 3 days. These are not just ScotMER funded projects, but projects that also feed into the work that we do. So some of them may be funded in other areas, but are directly relevant to offshore licensing, consenting, planning for renewable energy. ScotMER itself sits within Marine Scotland's Planning and Policy division, and we work very closely with the licensing and operations team. So the outputs that we have feed directly into planning and into policy as well as licensing. And so the work that we do is really important and integral, and we're in a unique position by sitting within this department and feeding into the work that's undertaken. But for more details on future projects we've coming up, I would really recommend that you check out the Forward Look session on ScotMER. That's going to be 4:15 to 5 p.m. on the 2nd of February, and we've got loads more information on new future projects coming up, which are quite exciting. But collaboration, none of the work we can do without all of you here today. You know, the work we don't do in isolation. We work with loads of different groups, whether that be academia through MASTS. We link up with the MASTS Renewable Energy Forum as well. We've got Scottish Renewables developers. They sit on every single one of our receptor groups, and we work really closely with Scottish Renewables to get industry involvement and engagement in what we do. And we also are involved in the regional advisory groups and subgroups as well with that. But as you'll see in the ScotMER collaboration session, again on the 2nd of February, that's 3:15 to 4 p.m, we work with a whole host of other strategic programs. So it's not just Scotland. We also work with BEIS, we work with OER and ORGIP across the UK. You know, we feed into OEC and EcoWind. We sit on some of the project steering groups for those as well. But we also work internationally. We've been working a lot with our colleagues in America through SEER, and I'm glad to see that some of them may be in attendance today. So it's great to have such international collaboration going on. And key to all of this is communication. The ScotMER Symposium, we're talking about all of our research outputs, communicating them to the community at large, but all of our reports are published and are all publicly available online. Again, this is the same link as before, so if you want to check out our website, you're more than welcome to come and see any of the reports there, and all of our reports will be eventually published there for those that are in progress. So just a final thank you very much for coming along to this. Gayle's going to be coming along next to talk about consenting and how ScotMER feeds into that. If you want any further details, check out our website or please contact us. But thank you all very much for coming along today, and I'm looking forward to getting to hear a lot more of these talks for the next 3 days, and hopefully you'll enjoy quite a bit that's going on. So thank you very much again.
I'm Gayle Holland, and I head up the consenting section of Marine Scotland Licensing Operations team. I've been with the team for about 12 years and have been involved in the ScotMER programme since its outset. MS Lot process all applications for Section 36, consents, marine licences and DPS licences for renewable energy developments. We make recommendations to Scottish ministers who make the final decisions on Section 36 consents. Really key to ensuring that recommendations and therefore decisions are robust is ensuring that they are informed by the best available evidence, and one of the key areas which inform decision making is the environmental factors. ScotMER over the years has delivered a diverse range of research and reports, but with the increase in the scale of development expected over the coming years, it's great that the programme has secured additional funding to continue to reduce the evidence gaps and add to robust decision making. In this presentation, I will look briefly back to see how things have moved on over the last 12 years. Then I'll look at how ScotMER links with other research and monitoring activities to inform consenting. I'll discuss some new challenges and finally conclude by looking at what we need to help ensure that the research and monitoring is feeding into robust decision making. Before we look forward, it's good to reflect a little. When I joined the team back in 2010, I recall sitting down with a colleague with a piece of paper trying to figure out what a tidal turbine collision risk model might look like. We relied largely on terrestrial evidence to inform bird collision risk, and there was no bespoke population models to rely on. Decisions were always made on the best available evidence, but that evidence has improved massively over the years. A couple of examples. Now we have specific collision risk and displacement models for seabirds informed by empirical data. We have bespoke population models for seabirds and marine mammals, and we'll soon have a tool, the Cumulative Effects Framework, for bringing all the seabird and marine mammal impact assessment methods together to allow a transparent cumulative assessment. We're beginning to understand a bit more about diatomaous fish and the impacts on commercial fish species and fisheries, but we recognise that there's still some way to go, as demonstrated by the recently published ScotMER evidence maps. ScotMER, of course, doesn't work in isolation. There are various other research initiatives that the programme engages with, including the Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Programme, the BEIS Strategic Environmental Assessment Research Programme, and more recently initiatives such as the OIC-funded Prepared project, looking at interactions between fish species and top predators around renewable energy developments. There's been significant recent developer monitoring, both at individual wind farm sites, including Highwind, Aberdeen Bay and Kincardine, as well as through the regional advisory groups in the Moray Firth and the Forth and Tay. Collaboration through the RAG groups has resulted in various programmes of seabird tagging work, digital aerial surveys and marine mammal monitoring. All the new information coming from the different sources needs to be carefully considered by key advisors, including Nature Scot, so that advice coming to MS Lot on assessment methodologies and predicted impacts is based on the best and most up-to-date information. With the announcement of the ScotWind option agreements and the current INTOG leasing round, the scale of development is a key challenge for consenting. There are new technologies, for example, floating wind, oil and gas decarbonisation and hydrogen production. There are new areas of development that we haven't considered before and where less information is available, such as over on the west coast and up around Shetland. There are new species to consider that we haven't really been present in development areas up until now, both seabird species including petrels and skuas, and marine mammal species such as other dolphin species. There's an increased focus on an ecosystem approach to assessment, and also with new technologies such as floating turbines, there are new potential impacts to consider, including wet storage, where the turbines may be stored close to the shore, waiting to be transported to site. It's not clear how extensive these wet storage areas will be, or how long the turbines will be there for, or the level of activity in these areas. There's the possibility of entanglement due to fishing gear becoming stuck on midwater cables with floating turbines, and there may be increased effects of electromagnetic fields from cables in the water column. And there's already some evidence of increased operational noise from floating turbines compared with fixed. There could be additional impacts on benthic communities and fisheries from the additional cable requirements associated with offshore wind. The cumulative assessment will be more challenging, and there may be the need for derogations and compensatory measures under the Habitats regulations, which is a new consideration for MS Lot. We've recently received the 4.1 gigawatt Berwick Bank offshore wind farm application, which is the first to include a derogation case with the application. So in conclusion, what do we need to ensure that consenting continues to be informed by the best available evidence? Given the new challenges, there's a heightened need to continue research and monitoring to reduce current precaution in assessment. There's a need to have data made more easily available, and there's a ScotMER project currently looking at this. There's a need to get research and monitoring reports published quickly. There's a need for continued collaboration on research and monitoring to get the very best information from the resources available. There's a need to ensure that research and monitoring results are reflected in guidance and advice so that they can be brought into decision making.